Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Populating Ice Age America with David Meltzer. I'm Beatrice Rehl. I'm the archaeology editor at Cambridge University Press, and I've had the pleasure to work with David on the second edition of his book, First Peoples in a New World, Populating Ice Age America, which is publishing this summer. David is here today to tell you about his book and answer your questions on prehistoric North America. Throughout the webinar, I'd like to invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button that you will find on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I'll read out your questions to David, and I also will be asking a few questions of my own. But first, I would like to introduce David, who is the Henderson Morrison Professor of Prehistory at Southern Methodist University. He researches the origins, antiquity, and adaptations of the first Americans and Paleo-Indians who colonized the North American continent at the end of the Ice Age. David focuses on how these hunter-gatherers met the challenges of moving across and adapting to the vast, ecologically diverse landscape of late glacial North America during a time of significant climate change. His archaeological and historical research has been supported by grants from the National Geographic Society, the National Science Foundation, and the Potts and Sibley Foundation, and the Smithsonian Institution. So now I'm going to turn it over to David.
Happy to chat with you today, Beatrice, about the new book. Let me say a few things about the book just to get us started here. The first edition was published in 2009. And I have to say it did very well. Reviewers were kind. People bought the book, but it quickly became obsolete in chunks of it. And I could foresee on the horizon that there were changes coming in this area of research. And I could anticipate those changes, but I didn't anticipate them quite well enough that I got everything in. And specifically what was happening was there was a revolution going on. And the revolution was the ability to acquire and sequence DNA, genetic material from ancient remains. I knew this was coming. I could see it on the horizon, but when the book came out, it was still a few years away. In the decade or so since the book first came out, there's been a huge number of developments that the ability to acquire and sequence ancient DNA is perhaps the most important, but there were quite a few others. And so when it came time to kind of rethink the book, I thought, okay, a decade has passed. We've learned a tremendous amount in just these last 10 years. There have been new sites found. We have a better understanding of the larger context of the peopling of the world and where the peopling of the Americas fits in. We've learned a great deal more about the landscape that they traversed, the routes they took to get here, how they expanded across the continent. And so it was high time to bring out the new edition. And that's going to happen. Well, I've got the page proofs on my desk. That will happen in just a month or so. You're muted.
Yeah, what's the single most important discovery that was made that really that pushed you to decide that it was time to do a second edition?
It really was the DNA. You know, I've been very fortunate that I got involved fairly early in a lot of this research, collaborating with Eske Willerslev at the Center for Geogenetics in Copenhagen. And over the last, well, let me sort of frame this up chronologically. The very first ancient genome was published in 2010. There were actually a series of them that came out. The first ancient North American genome, an ancient genetic sequence, was published in 2014. Since then, there have been quite a few that have been published, and they've completely changed our view of the peopling of the Americas. And I should explain why that is. I'm an archaeologist, and with archaeology, you can do a lot of things. You can determine the timing by which people came into the Americas. You can learn something about their adaptations. You can learn how they responded to environmental challenges. You can see how quickly they moved across the landscape. But the one thing archaeology has never been very good at is population history. How do these ancient people relate to present day people? How do present day people relate to ancient peoples? Has there been admixture between groups over time? Who are these groups? Where did they come from? What do we know about the source populations? These are questions that archaeology was never really poised to answer. What we have with the archaeological record are sort of snapshots of sites and artifacts. And while we can make certain assumptions and certain inferences about how archaeological material over here is related to archaeological material over there, we're never quite sure if we're right. And more than likely we're wrong. With ancient DNA, we are able to sort of link these different populations in a way that we never could. So it's not so much replacing archaeological knowledge as it's really enhancing it and supplementing it in really important ways. So with the genetics, what we've been able to do is get a much more nuanced and detailed picture of the whole peopling process. Who was related to who, how fast they moved across the landscape, be able to say, in this part of the country, we've got long periods of continuity over time, whereas in other areas, we've had populations sort of coming and going. So we're seeing things we could never see before. And that's really what drove the new edition.
This fundamentally changes how archaeologists work then, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going out in the field this summer. But, you know, look, this is a question that's fundamentally interdisciplinary. And I've always been, well, I've never paid much attention to disciplinary boundaries because these are kinds of questions that you need geology, you need to understand skeletal anatomy, you need genetics. And so we're really at a point where a lot of these disciplines are converging in a way that is suggesting that we might actually be close to answering some questions that we've been trying to answer for, a century, a century and a half, in terms of, you know, who were the first Americans? When did they get here? How did they get here? And with all of these converging lines of evidence, we're starting to get a pretty good picture of that whole process.
Could you give us an example of a site where you're getting consistent and converging results from different types of evidence?
Well, okay, so timing, the issue of timing. With archaeology, you always know the point by which people have arrived, okay? So if you've got, say, a 15,000-year-old site, you know that people have been in the Americas for 15,000 years, at least. But you're never going to find the very first footprints, the very first archaeological site that was ever created in North America, right? I mean, the odds are infinitesimally small that you would. So you know people got here before you actually see them archaeologically. I've used the phrase, you know, they're here, but they're below archaeological radar, probably for centuries and millennia before they're starting to produce enough sites that we are fortunate enough to discover to know, okay, yeah, they're here for sure. So with archaeology, we have a minimum age of when people got to the Americas. It's by at least 15,000. With genetics, we actually have a maximum age, because what genetics provides us with is the timing by which ancestral Native Americans split off from their Northeast Asian populations and started to head to the Americas. So we know, and this is, again, one of the things that we never would have been able to know before. We know now, by virtue of the genetic record, that Northeast Asians and ancestral Native Americans diverged from one another, one group staying in Northeast Asia, another group coming across the Bering Strait and the Bering Land Bridge around, say, 23,000 years ago. So we now have about an 8,000-year window within which we know that process must have taken place. And so the question is, you know, when within that 8,000 or so year window, well, then we turn to things like the glacial geological record. We turn to the records that we have from paleoclimates and paleoenvironments, and we can see that, okay, from the period from about 23,000 to about 19,000 years ago, you're in the coldest depths of the Ice Age. People probably weren't doing a lot of moving around on the landscape. They were probably hunkering down in refugia, areas that were sort of milder, if you can talk about sort of being in the midst of an ice age and finding a mild place to live, right? So there probably wasn't a lot of cross Bering Strait traffic at that point. But we know now that around 16,000 or so years ago, we start to see other species moving. We start to see elk, we start to see moose crossing over into the Americas from Northeast Asia. So and what that would suggest is that, okay, the climate and the environment is getting such, it's warming enough. We're coming out of the grip of the ice age. It's getting warm enough that other species are moving. There's a pretty good chance humans are moving at the same time. It doesn't mean they couldn't have come earlier, but it does suggest that these are conditions under which it would have been good to be moving. So again, all of these things, when you sort of pull together all these different threads, you get a really nice tapestry that starts to come together. Still a lot of questions to answer, but we're basically a whole lot further on than we were just a decade ago when the first edition of First Peoples came out.
Really impressive. How can geological evidence be effectively used in the studies? You've touched on that in your answer, but perhaps you could expand on that.
Sure. So North America during the depths of the Ice Age was a fundamentally different place than it is today. You had two massive ice sheets basically covering Canada. They went from Newfoundland all the way to the coast of British Columbia. Okay. They were upwards of 3.5 kilometers thick. And they extended from basically north of the Arctic Circle down to, well, central Ohio, right? These are massive, massive ice sheets. When those ice sheets are in place, I'm getting into teaching mode, so I'm waving my arms, and I realize that it seems kind of threatening to do that to the camera. I apologize to viewers out there. I'll try and control this a little bit better. He talks with his hands. I'm sorry. So we know that when you've got these massive ice sheets, they're basically going to be blocking the routes into the Americas, because once you get into Alaska during the depths of the Ice Age, it's a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end, because you've got these two massive ice sheets south of you, between you and North America, south of them, south of the ice sheets, the sort of the lower 48, as we would say here in America, right? So we need to know the timing of glacial advances. We need to know the timing of glacial retreats in order to understand what routes would have been open and when. And we know that there were basically two ways of getting from Alaska down to the lower 48 at the end of the Pleistocene. One was down the coast, and the other was down what's known as the ice-free corridor, which opened up between these two ice sheets down along the sort of eastern flank of the Rocky Mountains. One of the other things that we've learned in just the last 10 years, and again, it's because of ancient DNA, we have a much better handle on when these routes were open. So the geological record along the Pacific coast gives us a pretty straightforward record of ice retreat and when the coast was clear, as it were. The interior ice-free corridor has always been a bit of a puzzle, because we know that as the ice sheets began to melt and move apart from one another, and this corridor opens up between them, initially, it's going to be a pretty tough place to be, because when the ice sheets retreat, they're going to leave behind just lakes, massive mud flats. It's going to be cold. There's not a whole lot growing out there. So it's kind of two separate questions. When does the ice retreat far enough that you physically have a passageway between Alaska and the lower 48? And then secondly, when does it become biologically viable? You have people that are coming into a landscape where they've never been. No human's ever been there, right? They don't know when they're in Alaska that North America is down there, right? There's no stores along the way. They can't pack a lunch and make it from Alaska down to the northern plains of North America in a day, right? It's going to be a long passage. So they're going to have to wait until that passage has plants growing, has animals in there eating the plants. And we know that now because of ancient DNA work that I did with Eski Willerslev's group at Geogenetics. We have evidence from lake cores of when animals and plants started to colonize this corridor region. Work by another team led by Beth Shapiro in California showed bison populations in Alaska and bison populations further south, south of the ice, their movements and their exchange through that corridor. So we now know that my automatic lights just went off. We now know that the corridor into the Americas, the interior corridor, did not open early enough to meet the timing of the sites that we have. In other words, we have sites that are older than the opening, the viable opening of that corridor. So now everybody's attention is focused on the coast because the first people into the Americas must have come that way. Again, things that we wouldn't have been able to resolve a decade ago.
Very, very interesting. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about your book. What section of the book are you particularly proud of, and what do you find particularly interesting? I know that you love them all.
Yeah, right. You like all your children, right? You don't pick a favorite, and you like them for different reasons. So, well, look, this is where I do my research, and I, these are questions that I've been working on and thinking about for a very long time, and writing about for a very long time. I should probably explain. This book is based on, I published quite a number of papers on this topic, papers in the scientific journals. And so what this book is for me is an opportunity to take what I've learned that's gone through the gauntlet of peer review and provide it in a way that is good for a public audience, because I mean, fundamentally, this is a really interesting question. And this is a really interesting time period. And so, putting all this together has been just a lot of fun for me. If I had a favorite, oh boy. All of it? No, you don't want all of it. Okay, so look, every chapter is new in the sense that I've gone through and I've learned in the process of doing this, I've learned a lot in a whole lot of different areas. So for example, chapter 2 is on the environment. And there's a huge debate raging within the sort of glacial geological field about the causes and consequences of end of the Pleistocene warming, and specifically a very brief return to cool conditions. It's called the Younger Dryas. And I've been involved in a lot of the research on, we have this cold snap that happens at the very end of the Ice Age. What impact did it have on people? How would we know it? Was this happening at a rate fast enough to be even detected by people? So it was fun for me to sort of get into that literature and try and figure it out myself. Spoiler alert, we don't actually still know what caused this particular event, but it's been really interesting to me to have to go off and read the oceanographic literature, right? So the fun thing for me is actually the process of trying to figure it out and then write about it in a way that's intelligible and makes sense. So that part I enjoyed redoing chapter 2. Chapter 3 is historical. And even though nobody came back from the dead, there were new things to know about the 19th century controversy over the peopling of the Americas. Chapter 5 in the genetic stuff was probably the most challenging and the most fun, in the sense that with the genetics literature, it's happening so fast that you read a paper and you think you've got everything understood, and then 2 weeks later another paper comes out, you think, oh well, here we go again, I got to redo everything. So the genetics literature was fun because I was kind of racing to keep up with the very last minute latest findings on it and to explain it, and that was a challenge. But the other piece of this book is not only has it sort of gone through the gauntlet of peer review, it's also gone through maybe an even tougher audience, which is my students, right? This book, with certain changes and a lot of slides, is an entire course that I teach. And it's a tough audience, right? So yeah, I can get through peer review. That's not a problem. This is what I do, right? I'm an archaeologist. I can write papers. I can get them published. Keeping undergraduates interested, now that's a challenge. And being able to explain it is a challenge. So anyway, chapter 5, that was a tough one to write, but the most fun, I think, to write, just to make sure that I fully understood what was going on and I could be conversant. Now, I need to say, too, that I'd go on a lot of search and seizure missions across interdisciplinary lines. And thankfully, I have colleagues and collaborators and friends who will keep me from making mistakes. And I'm always willing and sort of pushing to get them to tell me, look, am I misreading your evidence? Make sure that you keep me on the straight and narrow here. And that's been a lot of fun, and especially in the last decade when I've been working very closely with geneticists, because this is not a field I'm trained in. I can't do this. I can't go into the lab and sequence a genome. On the other hand, my geneticist colleagues, they can, but they don't see and haven't got the background in terms of understanding the big picture and the questions that we're trying to answer. So it's been really fruitful and a wonderful collaboration to sort of be able to bring this into the book and talk about all the things that we've learned by virtue of sort of bringing all our strengths together. I don't
Let's
know
go
if that
back to your core audience for this book, your students. And you said that they're one of your biggest challenges. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that you face or your students face when encountering this material.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the midst of a global pandemic, a lot of it is just everybody's behind a mask, so you can't tell if anybody's getting it or not. That's a challenge. No, I mean, look, I feel an obligation to present our research to the larger community, whether it's folks who are just interested in this question or our students. And what you have to do is present the science, but I don't dumb it down. I mean, this is really important to me. I want to make sure that what I'm writing is reliable, it's precise, it's valid, and it's well explained. And sometimes it's tough sledding. I absolutely get that, right? But you really make an effort to make sure that you're taking complex things and explaining them in a clear manner without simplifying too much. I mean, there are certain bits that you just have to say, trust me on this one, because if we go down that rabbit hole, we're never going to come back, right? So, you make the effort to really make sure everybody's coming along with you and that they fully understand what it is that you're saying. And that's why, in the classroom, I'm constantly tracking everybody's facial expression. I'm looking at their eyes, I'm looking at their expression, and I'm making sure they get it when you're not in the midst of a global pandemic and wearing masks.
And what did the students get most excited about?
It varies. I'm teaching an honors class this semester, and one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is that they're really interested in the ethical issues, which have also become much more prominent in the last decade, because we're talking about DNA, right? And DNA is a fundamentally very personal thing. And there's a lot of discussion within the scientific community, within the indigenous Native American community, about the use of DNA. Now, when you're doing genetic research with live folks, you, me, whoever, you have to have a consent form. You have to get permission to do this research. Well, who do you ask permission from when you've got an ancient individual, 9, 10, 12,000 years old? Who speaks for them? And how do you speak for them? And what should you do when you have that kind of situation? And one of the nice things that's really emerged in just the last, really just half dozen years, is that there's been much better collaboration between the scientific community, the archaeologists, the geneticists, and members of the indigenous communities. So for example, when we sequenced the Kennewick genome, Kennewick was a terribly controversial find. It literally led to 20 years of debate and a tug of war as to whether the ancient remains would be studied or whether they would be returned to a number of claimant tribes in the Pacific Northwest who felt that Kennewick, the ancient one, they referred to him, was an ancestor of theirs and should be brought back to them. They didn't want the study done. There was a study, and at the end of that study, we obtained a small sample of Kennewick's finger, actually, and worked with a number of the tribes, some of whom, in fact, some individuals provided genetic samples that we could use for comparison. By doing that, it really, I think, in a lot of ways, has helped change the conversation for the better between the scientific community and the Native American community, because there are really important things to learn about the past from DNA, and not just things that we're interested in as people who are interested in the people in the Americas, but also things that are of great potential interest to Native American communities. So it's gotten a whole lot more nuanced, this whole discussion. Before we sort of, you would excavate a site, you would find stone artifacts, you'd report the age. But now when we're dealing much more directly with people, ancient people, it's become a much more interesting conversation, and hence a lot of the interest in the ethical implications of what it is that we're doing.
Great. Well, I'm seeing that there's a lot of questions that are starting to come in. And even before this webinar, I believe yesterday, we got the first question. And that is there any archaeological evidence to show whether the first migrants over the Bering Land Bridge and their descendants simply kept going until they reached Tierra del Fuego, or if the Americans were populated by a series of leapfrog movements, with the newcomers passing through the already settled groups until they reached empty land where they could settle?
Okay, I need to unpack that in a couple of ways. So first, coming down the coast, one of the sort of virtues, if you're coming into a new world and you don't know anything about it, you're in Siberia, you're in Alaska, it's all pretty much the same thing, right? You can go from Northeast Asia into Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, and mind you, it's more than 1,000 kilometers wide, so you have no sense that you're going from one hemisphere to another, and it all looks pretty much the same. The adaptations don't need to change. Imagine coming down south of the ice sheet, and you're in sort of the Pacific Northwest, and you start to move interior. As you go south, it's going to look very, very different. You're going to see animals you've never seen before. You're going to see a lot of plants you've never seen before. You're going to have to learn that landscape. If you come down the coast, and if you stay on the coast, and this I think was the question that was being asked, you can actually move fairly quickly because the structure of the environment is going to be relatively similar down the coast. Now, it's obviously going to change when you go from the coast of Southeast Alaska down to, say, the Santa Barbara Channel, right? Because it's getting warmer, you're getting further south, resources are going to be different, but the changes will be more incremental. But if you go from, say, the Pacific Northwest out onto, you go up the Columbia River, drop into the Snake River drainage, you get out onto the northern plains, it's a whole different ballgame, right? So you can move relatively quickly in environments that are more homogeneous, but when you're starting to cross ecological boundaries, it's a lot more complicated. And we think that, and this is getting to the leapfrog issue of the question, we suspect that people were moving into environments, large sort of patches. They'd sort of figure out what was going on, and they'd exploit a variety of different patches within a habitat, all the while probably sending out people. One of the things that a longtime colleague of mine, Louis Binford, used to say regularly was, insurance for hunter-gatherers is not knowing what you have right in front of you, it's knowing where you go when things go badly where you are. So we suspect that groups that are out on this completely unknown landscape, they don't know what's going to feed them, what's going to help them, what's going to cure them, what's going to try and kill them, because there were some fairly formidable predators out there, right? They're going to be constantly looking over the next hill. What's over the next hill? What's over the next hill? That would have been advantageous to them as newcomers to a new land. Now, the important thing is that you don't want to go too far too fast, because if you get going too far too fast and you sort of leave everybody else behind, one day you're going to look around and you realize, oh, we haven't seen anybody for weeks or months or years, right? No smoke on the horizon, no freshly killed animals. Where's everybody else? And you're going to realize at some point, you know, my kids are a marriageable age. I've got to find some other people out here. So we suspect these folks were highly mobile. We suspect they were, in fact, sort of jumping all over the place and checking out their new landscape. But we also suspect that they were making a strong effort to maintain distant connections so that they could exchange information, so that they could exchange mates, so that they could tell one another, okay, this is what works out here. We've left a cache of stone piled up under a tree. If you go, you know, 3 weeks in that direction and follow this drainage up that way, you'll see these kinds of things here waiting for you. We left them there for you. So it must have been an amazing experience to come into this environment where no human had ever been before and explore it. And when they came in, it was a wonderful place to be. You know, North America at the end of the Ice Age, it's emerging. The environments are changing, probably not that fast that people would have noticed, but it was completely untouched. It was a completely new landscape. I don't know, I hope that answered the question.
No, it was a great answer. I'll say one of the questions that has come in on the Q&A. Can you tell us how your work fits with or challenges indigenous descendants' own versions of their histories?
Yeah, so this is something that I've wrestled with. And this is also something that I'm not qualified to speak to, right? I'm an archaeologist. I recognize the limits of my ability. There are, and I've had conversations with folks who have talked to me about oral history and the importance of oral history and the potential value of it. I've stayed focused on the archaeological side of things because I don't want the archaeological record to be used against oral history or in favor of oral history, because I don't think these are kind of the same mechanisms for measuring the past or for looking at the past. And I don't really think that we can pull them together very effectively. So my goal has really been to say, okay, here's what we know from this perspective. And here's what the sort of the evidence that we have at the moment tells us. And I also am willing to and interested in hearing about what the native perspectives might be, as they may overlap or not with the evidence that I can pull together.
Okay, next question. Did dogs or wolf dogs arrive with the first peoples, or had domestication of dogs yet to take place?
This is a very timely question, because just 3 months ago, we published a paper on just that topic. And this came about because colleagues of mine who work with DNA and the ancient DNA of dogs over at Oxford University. I was over there giving a talk a couple of years ago, and I was looking at their dog dates, right? This is what we know about the history of dog domestication. This is what we know about how dog populations started to split off from one another. And I was looking at those dates and I was thinking, you know, those kind of match up with the dates that we have for people and people coming into the Americas. And then it dawned on me, I don't know why I hadn't thought about this before, but the fact of the matter is that people can come to the Americas without dogs, but dogs are not going to go to the Americas without people. And so when we pulled our data together, what we realized was that human population movements and the splits that are taking place within the human populations, okay, so you've got your Northeast Asian groups, and then you've got the groups that are leaving and heading across the land bridge. We've got a split of the people record right about there, again, 23,000 or so years ago. Well, sure enough, there's a split in dog populations about that same time, right? So you've got Asian dogs and you've got dogs that are splitting off and heading into the Americas. And then once they get south of the ice sheet, you've got these human populations that are diverging as they're moving south. at different time points. Dogs are doing the same thing. So clearly, we came we came to the America with our best friends. The dogs came with us. The dogs came with people, and they were probably and dogs, by the way, are the very first domesticated species, and they were domesticated literally 10,000 plus years earlier than any other domesticated species, and they were probably an integral part of the cultural repertoire. In other words, dogs would have been extremely valuable to people. They would let you know when predators were on the landscape and nearby. They would help with the hunt. They could help carry stuff. In a pinch, you could probably have them for dinner if you didn't have enough food. So dogs were probably an integral part of that movement into the Americas. And we just published that in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few months back. And in fact, there's a bit of discussion of that in the book, in First Peoples. I managed to squeeze it in. It literally is, this is brand new stuff, but it's in the book.
Great. Okay. What is your opinion of pre-Columbian trans-oceanic contact theories?
I'm not a fan, and I'll tell you why. We know when people started moving out across the Pacific, and we know this, and it's really quite clear, because every time folks got to a remote island in the Pacific, you can tell. And the reason you can tell is that in the archaeological record, in the sediment record, you see deforestation. You see a lot of the flightless birds that lived on these islands. Just think of the dodo, right? Humans got onto these islands and they very quickly, realized, oh, there's birds walking around. They can't fly because they've been living on these islands for literally thousands and thousands of years, and they've become an endemic species. You just walk up to them with a stick and whack them on the head. The rats and the dogs that were in the outrigger canoes, they're eating the eggs. So there's a tremendous human impact on these small islands as people move across the Pacific. None of that predates 3,000 years ago, right? And people get to the far, far eastern Pacific, places like Rapa Nui, Hawaii, only about 1,000 plus or minus years ago. So yes, people did move across the Pacific, but that's not part of the story of the original initial peopling of the Americas, which again takes place 15,000 plus years ago. Did they subsequently, once they got to places like Rapa Nui, actually reach South America? Well, there's been some papers that have literally just come out just a few weeks ago, that are in fact suggesting that some oceanic groups did in fact get to northwestern South America, and then went back to places like, I think Tonga is one of the islands, because there is some suggestive genetic evidence of Native American DNA on some of these remote Pacific islands. So moving across the Pacific in terms of reaching the Americas early on, not really any evidence for that, but contact between groups coming out of Oceania and Native Americans, that's an answer that still hasn't been resolved, but we're getting close on that one.
Okay, the next question. Many thanks for the very interesting lecture. Has any evidence been found yet near the coast to prove people arrived in the Americas by boat? And what is the percentage of Neanderthal DNA in the samples of old DNA?
Right. So no watercraft have been found as yet. The oldest evidence that we have along the coastal route, the potential coastal route, the earliest evidence we have of footprints is quite literally footprints. There's a remarkable site on the off the British Columbia coast where preservation has yielded literally a set of human footprints on a mud flat, and they've been radiocarbon dated to around 13,000 years ago. So it's not the footprints of the first people coming down the coast, but it's certainly a very early set of footprints. Watercraft, the odds are slim. If they were making boats out of wood, there's probably not a whole lot of wood that would have been available except driftwood, and that might have been a real challenge to make a boat out of driftwood. Skin boats were possibly used, but those are simply not going to preserve in the archaeological record, or at least so far. I mean, the archaeological record can occasionally surprise you and preserve things that you never would have thought preserved. So if there were boats used, we may one day get lucky, but so far we haven't. As for the percentage of Neanderthal DNA, generally we're talking about 2% plus or minus. Basically, about the same that I have in me.
Okay, so how reliable is this new ancient DNA data and the analyses? For example, in the literature, I have seen that the earliest dates for the appearance of Homo sapiens are anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 years BP, somewhere even 300,000 BP, presumably from mitochondrial DNA, so-called mitochondrial Eve. So if it gives divergent dates, how reliable is it?
Yeah, so it's a fair question. So with the molecular clock, so to speak, which is giving us those kinds of age estimates, the molecular clock is as good as the calibration rate and the calibration sort of time point that you're using to determine things like mutation rate. And these kinds of ages depend on, how accurate is your mutation rate, what's your generation time, various other factors. So they have big error bars, no question about that. However, as the years have gone by, we've gotten a much better handle on mutation rates and can get more precise. I'm not saying, look, this isn't radiocarbon dating, right? We're not getting something to plus or minus 50 years because we're talking about processes, we're talking about rates that we have to estimate and or infer. But what's happened in the last 10 years or so is that when you're looking at the DNA of radiocarbon dated specimens, you know precisely their age. And so you can get a much better handle on how old they are and thereby get a much better handle on the mutation rate between them and moderns and between them and their shared ancestor. So absolutely, the early mitochondrial age estimates, 160 to 200,000. That's a big ballpark that far back. As you get closer, however, as you get closer to the present, the error margin shrinks. It's still there. This is when you work in deep time, this is what you live with. I'm an archaeologist, plus or minus 100 years. I'm good with that. It would not work if you're heading to the moon and you say plus or minus a million miles and I'll hit the moon. That doesn't work. So for us, time, it's a little slippery as you get further back. Now, to the question about modern humans, we actually have skeletal evidence of early modern humans in Africa that, depending on the interpretation, could potentially be as old as 300,000 years. So we are starting to see convergence between genetic records, fossil records, archaeological records. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, next question. Was the coastal route on foot or by both or separate?
I think they were walking. And I think they were walking partly because, if you're walking, you can still take advantage of nearshore resources, right? You can get into tide pools, you can collect things in tide pools. But if these folks are coming across out of Northeast Asia, I suspect the predominant subsistence strategy is to go after terrestrial resources, to go after resources that live on land. Excuse me. So my suspicion is they were coming down the coast at a time when the ice had retreated. And mind you, you also had animals that were living along the coast that, as the ice was advancing, are getting sort of pushed onto offshore islands and the like. So there probably were terrestrial resources, and we know this actually from some of the ancient caves that have been excavated along the coast, that there are land mammals there. So it was probably the best of both worlds. If you were walking down the coast, if you're coming down the coast by boat and you fall out, that's not a good thing, right? Hypothermia sets in pretty quickly in that part of the world at the end of the ice age. So I suspect they're walking. I suspect they're taking advantage of near shore resources as well as terrestrial resources. They weren't doing deep sea fishing at this point in time. That we're pretty sure of.
How much work has been done in terms of pollen analysis in order to work out whether plants and which plants were growing in a given area, in terms of when it was feasible to make the journey and establish a permanent or semi-permanent settlement?
Yeah, lots is the quick answer. I mean, people have been doing palynology. In a lot of my projects, I'm working with palynologists because that gives us a really detailed and rich record of the vegetation that was available on the landscape, and importantly, vegetation and also the climate at the time, because by looking at the types of plants that were growing based on the pollen, you can get a sense of, because these plants and trees and whatnot have different sort of ecological and climatic tolerances, by looking at the pollen record, you can get a pretty good sense of what the environment and the climate were like. So there's been a tremendous amount of that work done. It varies geographically, and it varies geographically because pollen gets preserved very well in places like ancient lakes, where you can take a core out of a lake. And a project that we just wrapped up and have a separate book coming out this year on a site in the Rockies. We pulled a 5-meter long core out of the floor of this lake, and we have a record of vegetation for the last 16,000 years, which has helped us understand the environmental and climatic context within which the site that we're writing about in this other forthcoming book. We have a really good sense of what the environmental context was of the people who were living in this region 12,000 years ago. So absolutely, it's really important. And it does, in fact, help us get a much better sense of where people were, why they were, where they were, when they were.
Is there any kind of pattern to migration, or did settlers, migrate in a random way?
Yeah, so chapter 7 of the book actually has a lot of discussion about this. The quick answer is we don't really know whether it's random or pattern, simply because we don't have enough sites, right? We've got sites and we can connect those dots, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they traveled from dot A to dot B. What we suspect, and I talk about this a fair amount in chapter 7, is the whole question of what would be the most feasible way of moving across a landscape. And I talk about landscapes that are easy to traverse, but hard to navigate. So for example, the Great Plains of North America, you can just walk for days, but it's, if it's a cloudy day and it's just flat for thousands of miles around you, it's kind of hard to figure out which direction you're going, right? You can, if you've got plains and mountains in the distance, you can orient yourself. So travel can be easy, finding your way can be hard, finding your way can be easy, travel can be hard. I suspect, and again, this is suspicion more than anything else, that groups are kind of wayfinding by moving along major river systems. They're moving along where they can kind of track topographic high points to continue to orient themselves. There's a huge literature out there about how people learn space and sort of how they learn how to navigate space. And I talk about some of that in chapter 7 as well, because there's some really interesting psychological studies about differences in spatial awareness and how people sort of apply that to landscapes, and the possibility that it might be in some sense gendered. That has to do with sort of our human evolutionary past, and how, if you had sort of dimorphism, sexual dimorphism in terms of who's doing the hunting and who's doing the gathering, that requires sort of different spatial knowledge and being able to find things again, as opposed to just wandering off and going hunting and finding your way back. So the answer is we don't know what the patterns were, but it's a lot of fun to sort of think about it.
Okay, we have a comment from Richard Fisher who says, very interesting and compelling discussion. Broadening the chronological focus a bit, how can one reconcile the earlier dates of West Coast migration, Kennewick, at circa 16,000 BP, and the much earlier remains and finds in lower South America? Earlier remains, in fact, scouts or advanced exploratory parties of the main migration, or separate settlements and movements that happened considerably before 16,000 BP?
Yeah, for a long time, it was challenging to have the oldest site in the Americas. It's about as far from the Bering Strait and Bering Land Bridge as you could get, right? We had Monteverde in Chile, dated to around 14,700 or so, and we had nothing to the north. There's no way that people got across the Bering Land Bridge and then simply leapfrogged all of North America and ended up in far southern South America. So yeah, it was a challenge to reconcile, but that's changing, right? We are, and there's a number of new old sites that have been discovered in North America. Those are in chapter 4. Beatrice, I'm trying to remember to plug the book, so I will make a reference to the chapters. I get going. So we've got these sites now in North America that are as old, and in some cases older than Monteverde. So the pattern is starting to make more sense. So the question is absolutely on point. You should see the oldest in the north and moving progressively down further south. What we're seeing, though, and this is really interesting, in the genetic record that we have, we are seeing evidence that that movement was really fast. And the evidence, the nature of that evidence is that we have in genomic sequences from southeastern Brazil, individuals whose ancient genomes are extremely similar to ones from North America, which means that there weren't that many generations separating these two populations. So boy, it really looks like people got into the Americas and they went just blasting out across the hemisphere. And the other thing is that we're also seeing in the genetic record is that their populations were expanding dramatically. There's something like the geneticists are currently estimating something like a 60-fold increase in numbers when people got to the Americas and started dispersing throughout the hemisphere.
Wow. Okay, what do you think about the solutrean theory?
Okay. So yeah, I'm on record as being skeptical of the solutrean theory. And I'm skeptical for a whole variety of reasons. I've published with colleagues questions about the archaeological evidence on which it's based. I've published with colleagues about the genetic evidence, which shows that it didn't happen. I mean, fundamentally, it doesn't work. And here's why it doesn't work. If a group of solutreans, okay, so just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, solutreans are people who were in Northwest Europe and France and Spain 18 to 20,000 years ago. And there are some similarities between there's a few similarities, let me underline the word few, between solutrean technology and artifacts in technology in Clovis. But you need to understand too, that there's about a 6,000 year gap between solutrean and Clovis, right? So there's a huge span of time in between those two things. So yeah, you've got similarity, but does that mean there's a direct historical link? Doubtful. And here's why. If a group of solutreans do in fact make it over from Northwest Europe and land in the Americas, they are going to come equipped with their full complement of culture. So what you would expect in the early American archaeological record is a whole suite of archaeological materials that would be basically identical, if not highly similar to what they had brought over. And we don't see that. We don't see that at all. Early on, it was supposed that with individuals like Kennewick, that maybe he didn't quite look like Native American, so maybe he possibly had come from someplace else. We showed that Kennewick is in fact Native American, absolutely. But most importantly of all, when Eski's group, when we sequenced the Anzac genome, which is the genome of a Clovis child, young child buried with Clovis artifacts, he was absolutely Native American, and there was absolutely nothing solutrean or European about him, right? So if in fact somehow solutreans made it over here, they had complete and total cultural amnesia. They forgot all about the artifacts that they were making in Northwestern Europe. They had genetic amnesia. They left behind their genomes. There's just absolutely no evidence for it. So yeah, that's in chapter 6.
We have time for one last question. And David Kilby writes, on behalf of my Intro to Archaeology class, as genetics becomes a more powerful tool, what does archaeology bring to the table? What can archaeology tell us that genetics can't?
Hi, Dave. That's not a plant, but I do know David Kilby. So look, archaeology still tells us a hell of a lot. There's no question about it. Genetics, it's wonderful, but it doesn't tell us about the nature of people's adaptations. It doesn't tell us precisely when people arrive in the Americas. It doesn't tell us why people left Northeast Asia. It doesn't tell us what challenges they faced. It doesn't tell us anything about the environment through which these groups passed. So, you know, genetics is great, but it's not a replacement. And you know, we've sort of been living in kind of a golden age. You know, this technique and this technology was invented, and suddenly, you know, everybody wants to do genetics. It's really cool. You learn a lot. I get all that, but it's just one. It's just one person at the table, as it were. I'll use Dave Kilby's metaphor. Everybody gets a seat at the table. Everybody still has to have a seat at the table because there's so many things that genetics can't tell us about the whys and the hows and the wherefores and the whens that it's not going to replace us. We've still got job security as archaeologists.
Okay, I think that just about wraps up where we are. Thank you so much for such an interesting, fascinating, wonderful webinar. And thanks to all the participants also for tuning in and listening to this wonderful communication. Thanks so much.